Hi, I'm Thomas McColl, and I'm going to be today reading some poems from my new book, Grenade Genie, which is published by Phoney War Press, and is available from the publisher and available direct from me as well, if you wanted a signed copy. The book is subtitled 25 Brief Studies of the Cursed, Coerced, Combative and Corrupted. And the book is split into those four sections: cursed, coerced, combative and corrupted. And I'm going to read two poems from each of those sections. The poems are all kind of about all kinds of subjects, but each one of the poems they broadly fit in with the subject, the section that they're contained in. And the first poem that I'm going to read from the first section, Cursed, is a poem that I read the other day on BBC Radio Kent. Now, I live in London, but one reason that I was reading it on BBC Radio Kent is that the poem is set in Margate, and it's a poem about T.S. Eliot's Instagram poetry and how I fit in with both, and it is modestly called The Greatest Poem. I've been thinking that if I visit the Nayland Rock Shelter overlooking Margate Sands at the right time in the autumn of 2021, exactly 100 years on from when Thomas Stearns Eliot went there to write his masterpiece, The Wasteland, the greatest poem of the 20th century, then if I sit there long enough with my laptop, maybe I'll end up writing the greatest poem of the 21st century. Things in my favour. My first name is Thomas. I once worked for Lloyd's Bank and I write poetry. Things that might go against me. My surname isn't Eliot, it's McColl. Working for Lloyd's Bank is in itself no indicator of literary talent, and anyway, history doesn't tend to repeat itself. In fact, what if this time round the inverse happens, and I end up writing the worst poem of the 21st century? In the current climate, it's highly likely. Let's face it, Thomas Stearns Eliot had advances in psychoanalysis to help him get in the right frame of mind, whereas all I have is advances in social media. Who knows? Maybe by 2021, I'll have no choice but to fit my opus into 4 lines on Instagram. But then when I do, my simple artless platitude will inexplicably receive 1 million likes, and then released as part of a book will inexplicably sell 1 million copies. And my poem will be so bad that everyone will definitely remember it much more than whatever the best poem of the 21st century will actually be. Written perhaps by someone who, like Eliot, may be going through difficult times, and talented enough to harness adversity, will out of that create a brilliant epic poem. But unfortunately, there'll no longer be anyone with the attention span to read it, let alone publish it. And he or she in despair will delete it and give up writing altogether. Whereas I'll go on to publish book after book, and William McGonagall will turn in his grave at no longer being the worst poet in the English language, usurped by Thomas McColl, now famous for having written the worst poem of the 21st century, or indeed any century. But that's the thing, writing the worst ever poem is no barrier anymore to immense success. Thomas Stearns Eliot may well have been the best, but there's no room for that now. Now it has to be 4 lines or less, and totally trite. 1921, been and gone. 2021, bring it on. Thank you very much. Now, sorry if I don't actually see the messages all the time because I'm not wearing my glasses all the time. And it's very reassuring to see you all there. Thank you very much. The next poem, the other poem that I'm going to read from the Curse section is the title poem. So it's called Grenade Genie. And with this poem, it's kind of about how if you possess genius, but it was encased in a live grenade, and the only way you could access it was by pulling on the pin. Would you do it? And I mean, there are people that have the kind of genius to actually change the world who are prepared to do it, and that's really what this poem is about. So this is the next one I'm going to read from the Cursed section. Grenade Genie. Possessing genius is one thing, but are you prepared on finding it encased inside a grenade to pull out the pin to release the genie and therefore be on the receiving end of the huge explosion? In other words, are you prepared to be obliterated, meaning you won't even get to see above the billowing smoke the now released genie granting every wish to all your atoms that dispersed and already forming into new but lesser versions of you will proceed to take all the credit you are due, as if you'd never actually existed, as if the credit had always been theirs to take. Essentially, it's genius for everyone else's sake but yours. You're still the only kind of genius worth possessing, the kind that changes everything. Grenadeless genius is worthless. It's just that if it turns out you're the one who pulls the pin, there's no guarantee you'll even be remembered. For only one thing is certain. The Grenade Genie, arbiter of atoms, doesn't care. He knows that genius is a combustible commodity. Once released, he's simply there to give out all the credit indiscriminately. Anyway, the undeserving horde that ends up in receipt of it will soon enough be wiped out too, when everyone least expects it, in the unlikeliest place, and it's almost always the unlikeliest person who'll set things off. So who knows, maybe it will be you, out of luck and living in abject poverty, with nothing to lose, your possession of genius amounting nothing more than the pulled pin held between your teeth, and the self-belief that got you there. Except that there, as it turns out, is right in the middle of nowhere. But that's fate. And though the explosion will mean your life ending without you being in any way rewarded, the main thing is that history will be made, and incredibly. Vast armies of advancing traditionalists who seem to everyone unstoppable, all taken out with just one genius-filled grenade. And who knows, maybe the day will come when the atoms you released upon your death, which having congealed into lesser versions of you, the genie bestowed all credit upon, will in gratitude honour your selfless act by placing at the very spot where you blew yourself up a commemorative plaque as round and blue as the earth which in billions of years the sun will swallow up. And that's the thing, why none of it really matters. Even the round blue earth, along with your round blue plaque, must one day shatter into atoms too. Let's face it, everything and everyone is nothing more than atoms. Even the brightest human is nothing more than the lowliest animal, organism, or inanimate object. It doesn't take a genius to work that out. And though nothing matters when we're all just matter, it still remains that people who think they're more than what they're made of are there to be brought down. Even if that moment's unplanned, the Grenade Genie, arbiter of atoms, will always be on hand. Trust me, somewhere, right at this very moment, a moment born out of desperation, there's another rat amongst the dinosaurs about to pull out the pin with its teeth. Thank you. Right, I'll have some water after that. It was quite a long poem. Well, that was a couple of poems from the cursed section, and I mean, a lot of the poems in this book are about people being expendable or feeling that they are, and this next poem is very much about that. And this is the first poem I'm going to read from the next section, the coerced section, and it's a poem that's simply called Security Pass. I've just been made permanent, yet already I know I'm completely expendable. In any event, I've today at last received a full security pass. It comes complete with a freshly taken photograph, my face displaying a grimace that was nothing more than confused surprise at the sudden camera flash, an expression that could almost pass for a desperate act of brave defiance, that no one's fooled and no one cares. Anyway, the doors opening in this building aren't opening for me, but for the magnetic stripe across the card. I know full well already that it's numbers on a line, not the letters in my name the system recognises, that a thin row of binary will always trump any last shred of humanity. Let's face it, though now clearly displayed in bold, my name, Thomas McColl, remains completely incidental, as impotent as a name that just about belongs still to some hitherto proud family firm, which having been swallowed up by a vast conglomerating entity, is slowly but surely stripped of its former identity, until there's nothing left but the name itself, a name that's only been kept in place to satisfy some irritating legal obligation. Thomas McColl Limited, that's me, limited, extremely limited, a lowly worker whose pass gives him access to just one floor in a 42-floor building. Well, here I am, on the 41st floor. As soon as I exit the lift, directly in front of me, the main door, and there above it, the clocking in and out security camera, an irritating creature which is probably related in some way to the camera that took the annoyingly crappy picture displayed on my pass. Then catching my reflection in the door's dark glass, an expression that could almost pass for a desperate act of brave defiance, I realise in a flash that my mug in fact has now been set to project a permanent stamped on the face look of confused compliance, and that my brand new pass doesn't represent me, but that I simply represent my brand new pass. Thank you. Right, let's put my glasses on again. I can see the screen. Right, and the other, well, from the first poem in the coerced section to the last poem in the coerced section, and it's about not being able to remember someone's name, but still being compelled to have to say it. And it is a true story, and this poem is called Jan, Jen or Jean. I hadn't seen her in years. Her name was Jan, Jen or Jean. I couldn't remember which. My face lit up like a fruit machine when she caught my glance as we passed each other on Southwark Bridge. "Hi, Tom," she said, and as if she'd pressed play, I felt compelled to take the chance. The names began to spin inside my head. Jan, Jen, Jean. I pressed stop too quickly. I had little choice and settled on Jean. "Hi, Jean," I said. We passed. I pressed collect and got a sick feeling in my gut as the name Jan for first prize flashed before my eyes. That's happening to me all the time, but anyway, there we go. And so yeah, we're on to the third section of the book, combative. And the first poem I'm going to read from that section is one called Shopping with Perseus. And it's about me as a teenager going on my first solo shopping trip to Oxford Street, which isn't really necessarily a very exciting subject in itself. So I've added some monsters into the mix just to spice it up a bit. And but it is actually really meant to be, it is intended to be like a satire on consumerism. And it's just kind of, in a way, it's almost like a short story, this one. Anyway, so yes, Shopping with Perseus. The night before I made my first daunting solo... Actually, I'll start again. Okay, solo. I always stop saying it like that, but anyway, right, here we go. Shopping with Perseus. The night before I made my first daunting solo shopping trip to Oxford Street, Perseus appeared in the dark at the end of my bed. He gave me such a fright, but it was uncanny. His tunic, sandals, curly hair and ruggedness were exactly as depicted in the book I'd studied that day at school. He ordered me to sit up and listen carefully, for he was here, he said, to warn me about a new type of Gorgon, the fashion victim, which lurked in every clothing store on Oxford Street. The fashion victim is hideous. Don't look directly at one. Anyone who gazes into an undiscerning eye gets turned to plastic. You must believe it, Tom. Where did you think those showroom dummies come from? I was stunned by this revelation, and Perseus, seeing he had my full attention, continued. Fashion victims can be recognised by their permanently bulging eyes caused by ridiculous prices on labels and the multicoloured dreads which are actually snakes. With that, I immediately knew that what he thought were Gorgons were simply people copying the glamour grebo style of the Kill Kids, whose latest and biggest hit was Snake Eyes, and Perseus, having obviously seen the video, in which their multicoloured dreads turn into snakes, had mistakenly thought that what was simply fashion was a matter of life and death. Your mission is to enter their lair. Their lair? It's called Topshop. Locate and buy one pair of winged sandals, make sure they're the red ones, and then straight away get out of there. I would go myself, Tom, but I am 3,000 years old, far too old to get served in a place like that. But you are young. Your lack of fashion sense has rendered you invisible. There are mirrors everywhere to guide you, and your teenage habit of gazing at your shoes and never looking into people's eyes when they talk to you nor you to them will hold you in good stead when dealing with these creatures. So go forth and get me the winged sandals in red. Well, I knew even then that I wouldn't be able to find what he was looking for, and the Gorgons weren't actually Gorgons. But not wanting to make a 3,000-year-old man feel bad, I decided the following night, when Perseus came to see me again and asked me how my shopping trip had gone, to make up a story. I told him I went into Topshop as instructed and onwards up to Topman. And when he asked, did the Gorgons appear, I said no, as word had spread that a fearless human, protected by Perseus and the goddess Athena, was on his way, and they'd all be killed if they stuck around. But unfortunately, before the Gorgons fled, they destroyed all the stock in the winged sandal section, and that's why I couldn't get my hands on a pair. Perseus, though crestfallen, thankfully seemed to buy my story. He said, "Don't worry about it," then asked me for one more favour. Could I next week go instead to Gap and get him a cap of invisibility? Thank you very much. Right, well that's so that was one of the poems from the combative section, and the other one I'm going to read from that section is one called the Phoney War. Well, recently was the anniversary of VE Day, of course, the end of the Second World War, and I grew up as a child in the 70s, and there was so many movies about the Second World War on at that time, and documentaries, a lot of fascination with World War II. And when I was a kid, I was always playing army with my friends, kind of playing at being in World War II, and that is ostensibly what this poem is about, but it is about more than that as well, which shall be revealed. And so this is it, the Phoney War. Our imagination's at war, with umbrellas for rifles, our enemy invisible. We defended the sofa, had it pulled out from the wall. Inside this narrow tunnel, with seat cushions overhead, we hid. With each attack, we watched each other's backs. You saw the Germans in your mind I could not see, and I saw mine. We shot them all too easily. With the airstrikes, though, we met our match. Shells like steel fists struck, and the seat cushions punched up into the air fell about us. So we rose and came out fighting, shot down 5 fighters and 3 bombers with 2 umbrellas, and finished off the conflict in close hand-to-hand combat. By the end, there were 1,000 German casualties, and without even a scratch between them, 2 tired Tommies smoking pencils, feeling tough. And now the war was finished, and with both of us famished, we ran from the living room into the kitchen, calling for Gran to serve us up our tea, and found her quietly sobbing at the stove. So that was that poem about how the war is still very real for people even at that time. And from the last section, Corrupted, I'm going to read 2 poems from there, of course, as well. And the first poem that I'm going to read from that section is one called "The Surgery I Go to Has a Two-Headed Doctor." And the NHS had its an anniversary quite recently, a couple of years back, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the NHS, and this poem was originally in an anthology at that time, and it's meant to be emblematic of the government kind of cutting costs and cutting corners in relation to the NHS. So it is a kind of satirical piece. Anyway, so this is the piece. The surgery I go to has a two-headed doctor. The surgery I go to has a two-headed doctor. Dr. Smith will see you now. It gets very confusing. Dr. Smith via his left head gives me a diagnosis. Then via his right head gives me a second opinion, which always differs from the first. And that opinion is never the best one, always the worst. When Dr. Smith examines me with a stethoscope, it's in the left head's left ear and the right head's right ear. In other words, he makes a right pig's ear and also a left pig's ear of any examination he does. However, when I once challenged him about it, Dr. Smith's left head simply said, "Can you breathe in a bit more deeply, please?" while his right head shook morosely. Apparently his wife has got two heads as well, and two pairs of breasts. It's said they met as impoverished but physically normal students, earning money by undergoing laboratory tests. Two heads are better than one, they say, but I'm not too sure that comes into play while attending an appointment with the always in two minds Dr. Smith. Thank you very much. And how are we doing? Oh yes, we're almost up to the time. So the last poem that I'm going to read from the corrupted section is the last poem in the book, and It's a poem about a library, but not just any old library. It's a literal library, and it's kind of this poem is a means of looking at various ideologies in a slightly quirky way through the prism of this literal library. So this is the poem that closes the book, Grenade Genie, as I was saying, out with Fly on the Wall Press, and available directly from them or directly from myself if you wanted a signed copy. So this is the last poem I'm going to read today. Thanks very much for listening, and sorry I wasn't able to necessarily read all the messages, but because I just didn't have my glasses on most of the time. But yeah, so this is the last poem, Literal Library. In the local literal library, under the section marked the Nazis, there are hundreds of books by gay, Jewish and socialist authors, and at the end of each shelf a box of matches. In the section marked Islam, there are 50 copies of the Quran and just one book of interpretation, which changes frequently depending on which fundamentalist group has control of the shelf. There's no longer any room for books which are off message on the liberalism shelf, which unfortunately has been taken over by hardline fanatics. Dwarfing all these sections is a whole bay reserved for capitalism, shelves which are fully stocked, though only with copies of a book entitled Choice. So much choice, but that's the thing, no choice but choice, and only one kind of choice, choice but no choice. Meanwhile, the bay beside it marked communism, which collapsed many years ago, is yet to be repaired, with the full extent of the damage hidden still by life-size cardboard cutouts of Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il, and remaining rigidly in position, therefore less obvious a wreck, but just as wrecked all the same. The half bay that's allocated to the Roman Catholic Church has somehow ended up with multiple copies of the Sex Guide for Lovers, all of them masquerading as religious books, with identical pictures of the Pope on all the covers. While the other half of the bay, the half the Roman Catholic Church looks down upon, atheism, is completely and utterly empty, only because the books have all been borrowed, and in the literal library, once a book is borrowed from that section, no record is kept. Right, well, thank you very much for listening and tuning in. And I've actually very much enjoyed that, actually, after a kind of slightly shaky start, but then really got into it. So, thanks very much. Cheers, and bye for now. And enjoy the rest of your breakfast if you haven't had it already. Right, bye. Thanks a lot. Cheers.